At Easter dinner, my mother stood at the head of my sister's dining table and raised her wine glass like she was hosting a magazine shoot. She smiled and said she wanted to celebrate responsible homeowners, her eyes drifting toward the vaulted ceilings like the house itself was proof of character. Then she added, softly but clearly, "Not everyone is ready for homeownership," and turned her head until her gaze landed directly on me. "Renting is safer for someone like you." I felt my jaw lock so tight it actually hurt. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a plain envelope, and set it carefully beside her plate. "You should open that." She tried to keep smiling. That was the first thing I noticed. The smile stayed, but it didn't fit her face anymore. She picked up the envelope with a small, almost annoyed laugh, like this was some dramatic overreaction on my part. The seal wouldn't tear cleanly. Her fingers slipped. She muttered something under her breath. The paper slid out, fell against the edge of her plate, and for a split second, she just stared at it instead of picking it up. When she finally did, her shoulders went stiff. The color drained from her cheeks so fast it was almost visible. Her breathing changed, short, shallow pulls like she'd walked up too many stairs. The room had gone quiet. I didn't say anything else. I just watched her read. "My name is Natalie Mercer. I'm 34. While she stood there holding those papers, I had this strange split-second awareness of how long that narrative had been building. In my early 20s, I lived in a studio apartment just outside Seattle. It was technically urban loft style, which really meant the kitchen sink was 3 feet from my bed and the radiator clanged like it was arguing with itself every night. I worked in cloud security, long hours, a lot of responsibility, decent money for someone my age. But I carried heavy student loans because when I was 19, my mother told me my custodial college account had been wiped out in a market downturn. She said it gently, regretfully, like we'd both been victims of bad timing. I believed her. So I signed the loan papers and adjusted. I told myself that being self-made would be good for me. Meanwhile, my sister Lauren bought a 4-bedroom house at 26, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a landscaped yard. My mother talked about it like Lauren had climbed Everest barefoot. Discipline, she'd say, budgeting, stability. Words that felt like they had an invisible opposite attached to them, my opposite. One Thanksgiving, hosted at Lauren's house, my mother gave a full tour to extended relatives. I remember trailing behind them through the kitchen, listening to her describe the granite countertops and the guests suite like she'd installed them herself. She ran her hand along the island and laughed about how proud she was of Lauren's mature financial decisions. Then, almost casually, she mentioned my up-and-down tech job. Said renting was probably smarter for someone like Natalie. The phrase hung there. Someone like Natalie. People didn't know where to look. A few polite smiles, a small shrug from an aunt. Lauren laughed, not cruelly, just reflexively, and that almost made it worse. I stood there holding a dish towel, feeling like I'd been publicly categorized, not irresponsible enough to scold, not successful enough to celebrate, just volatile, risky. After that, it became subtle. Comments about how stressful my industry must be, little reminders about how security matters when making big decisions. I started noticing how often I was framed as the uncertain variable in any comparison. A few weeks after that Thanksgiving, I found out there was a family Christmas planning group chat I hadn't been added to. I didn't discover it dramatically. I saw my cousin mention something about secret Santa assignments and realized I hadn't gotten anything. When I asked, Lauren said she assumed Mom had added me. Mom said she thought Lauren had. It was brushed off as a tech oversight. But it didn't feel accidental. It felt like the natural extension of a story that had already been written about me, the unstable daughter. The one still figuring things out. The one who should be handled gently, excluded from logistics because I was unpredictable, financially behind, emotionally sensitive. Standing there at Easter years later, watching my mother's fingers tremble over that page, I knew this moment hadn't started tonight. It started in that tiny studio apartment with student loan statements stacked on my counter, and it grew every time someone compared square footage like it was a character reference. And she had been narrating that story for a long time. The call came the following November. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I was still at my desk, the office mostly empty, fluorescent lights humming overhead. My phone buzzed with my Uncle Robert's name. He didn't call me often, birthday texts, the occasional forwarded article about cybersecurity because he liked telling people his niece worked in internet defense. So I answered expecting something light. His voice wasn't light. He told me he'd been going through some old financial documents. He used to help my parents organize paperwork years ago, back when things were simpler and no one questioned who handled what. He said there was something I needed to know. I felt that word, needed, land in my chest before he even finished the sentence. He told me the $39,760 that had been sitting in my custodial college account didn't disappear in a market downturn. It was withdrawn. The month I turned 19. There was a pause after he said that, like he was waiting for me to correct him. I didn't. I just stared at the glass wall of the conference room across from me and felt my hearing narrow. He continued. 2 weeks after that withdrawal, almost the exact same amount appeared in my parents' joint checking account. From there, it was applied toward a down payment. The timing aligned precisely with Lauren's first home purchase. I remember gripping the edge of my desk so hard my fingers hurt. I asked him to repeat the number. $39,760. He didn't hesitate. He said he had copies of the statements. Copies. The word felt heavier than the number. This wasn't suspicion. It wasn't family gossip. It was documentation, dates, transfers, account numbers, paper. My body reacted before my mind caught up. My face went hot, but my hands were cold. I had this strange buzzing in my ears, like altitude pressure. I stood up because sitting suddenly felt impossible. I walked to the window even though it didn't open. He told me he'd witnessed the withdrawal paperwork years ago. At the time, he assumed I knew, that it had been discussed. He didn't realize I'd been told a different story until recently, when something in conversation didn't add up. I don't remember exactly what I said in response. I know I thanked him. I know I told him I needed the copies. My voice sounded measured, almost calm, which scared me more than if I'd cried. When we hung up, I didn't call my mother. That's what still surprises people when I tell them this part. I didn't confront her. I didn't send a furious text. I didn't drive anywhere. I stood in that quiet office and let the reality settle into something solid. 14 years of believing the market had betrayed me. 14 years of listening to commentary about stability and discipline. 14 years of quietly accepting a version of myself that had been financially behind. I understood very clearly in that moment that if I confronted her immediately, the conversation would dissolve into emotion. Tears, sacrifice narratives, maybe even anger about how ungrateful I was. I wanted something else. So I asked my uncle to email me the statements, and I went back to my desk, sat down, and opened a blank spreadsheet instead of my phone. I didn't sleep much that week. Instead, I built a spreadsheet. Not a casual one, not a track my spending template. I opened a blank file and started typing numbers with a kind of precision that felt almost surgical. Salary, taxes, loan balances, investment accounts, monthly burn rate. I pulled up the scanned statements my uncle had sent and typed in the exact number, $39,760. I stared at it for a long time before creating a new column labeled target. I set a number that scared me. Not just enough to recover what had been taken, enough to make the entire narrative irrelevant. Enough that no one could ever use the word safer around me again. The target meant years of discipline. It meant tightening things that were already tight, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt focused. For the first time, I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was recalculating. A few weeks later, my mom called me out of the blue. She sounded bright, helpful. She said she'd spoken to someone she knew in Phoenix who had affordable condos and thought it might be perfect for me. She mentioned how much lower the cost of living was there, how it would be a fresh start. She said she'd already told a few relatives I might be considering something smaller and more manageable. Smaller. Manageable. I held the phone away from my ear for a second so I wouldn't say something sharp. She wasn't offering assistance. She was reinforcing the story, publicly. I told her I wasn't looking right now. She sighed, not dramatically, just enough to signal that I was being impractical. After we hung up, I updated my spreadsheet again. Around that same time, Lauren posted a long birthday tribute to our mother. It was my birthday. The post wasn't cruel, just glowing. Thanking her for always believing in me, for supporting her home purchase, for teaching her discipline. The comments filled up with heart emojis and affirmations about strong mothers and successful daughters. I read it twice. Then I closed the app and moved money into my investment account. That became the rhythm. Instead of correcting the narrative, I stepped out of it. I stopped discussing my job in detail. When promotions were hinted at, I kept them quiet. When my mom made small remarks about instability or stress in tech, I didn't defend myself. I stopped giving her material. I cut every unnecessary expense. Subscriptions gone, weekend travel reduced. I cooked at home. I refinanced what I could. I automated investments so I wouldn't be tempted to touch them. Every bonus went straight into index funds. Every raise, when it came, would already have a destination. Emotionally, I pulled back too. Not dramatic silence, just less availability, fewer reactive texts, shorter calls. If I felt myself starting to justify my life, I ended the conversation politely. There were moments when the anger tried to surface, usually late at night when the apartment was quiet and the radiator started clanging again. But instead of spiraling, I'd open the spreadsheet and watch the numbers move, even if only slightly. I didn't announce any of it. No declarations about independence, no social media milestones, no dramatic conversations. I let them keep believing I was figuring things out. And quietly, I began building something they didn't know existed. A few months into my quiet rebuild, I asked for a meeting with my department head, Caroline Whitaker. I'd always respected her bluntness, and I needed perspective that wasn't filtered through family bias or office politics. Her office smelled faintly of peppermint and coffee, a combination that usually made me relax. Except that day, I was tense, sitting on the edge of the chair, hands fidgeting with the strap of my bag. "Natalie," she said, leaning back, hands folded, eyes sharp but not unkind, "you're talented, technically brilliant. But I've noticed a pattern. You shrink yourself in meetings. You defer when you shouldn't. You let others claim credit quietly." I swallowed hard. It was both a shock and a relief. I'd suspected it in myself, but hearing it aloud made it tangible. I nodded, silent, letting her words sink in. Then she leaned forward. "I'm going to give you a chance to lead a major audit, healthcare security. It's complicated, high stakes. You'll have visibility with executives. You'll have a team reporting to you." My stomach dropped. The challenge was enormous, exhausting, terrifying, and exactly the kind of spotlight I'd avoided at family gatherings for so long. I agreed because I knew now that hiding wouldn't change anything that mattered. The year that followed was relentless. I was logging 12-hour days, sometimes longer. My team looked to me for every clarification. Executives bombarded me with questions that had no easy answer. I traveled for briefings, cross-checked every line of code, every protocol, every compliance checklist. Some nights I returned to my small apartment, shoulders tight, jaw sore, heart racing from exhaustion rather than fear. But each time I closed my laptop, I updated the spreadsheet, tracking bonuses, promotions, projected growth. No announcements. No celebrating, just measurement. Finally, after nearly a year, it was over. The audit closed successfully, and Caroline promoted me to team lead. My salary jumped to $118,500. It was gratifying, the kind of victory that didn't need applause. I updated the spreadsheet, watched the numbers align, and exhaled quietly. No one outside my small circle knew. Then came Christmas at Lauren's house. I tried to enjoy the cookies and the faint pine scent, but my mother made sure to include the usual commentary about Lauren's remodeled kitchen. The way she ran her hands across the counters, the faintly pointed mention of the new appliances, it was all a reminder. Some things, in their eyes, would always be comparisons. I forced a polite smile, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest, and kept my responses short. Lauren's husband, Eric, leaned toward me quietly as Mom lectured about budgeting and the virtue of discipline. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I've noticed how this pattern repeats, years of subtle comparisons." I barely nodded, my face still smiling, but there was a warmth in that acknowledgement. Someone had seen it too, without needing me to explain. That night, I returned home and added the final columns to my spreadsheet. a sense of quiet satisfaction settling in. The humiliation, the subtle comparisons, the underestimation, they were being transformed into something tangible, measurable, and eventually undeniable. Not long after that Christmas, my mother shifted tactics. Instead of veiled comments about homes or kitchens, she started trying to set me up with a man she described in detail. He owns his home outright, very stable, financially responsible. She presented it as concern for my well-being, but the undertone was unmistakable. Property ownership and marital status were the metrics she used to define a person's worth. Every phone call, every brunch, every holiday gathering carried an implicit lesson: be measured by square footage and the mortgage balance, not by your accomplishments or independence. At first, it irritated me. I wanted to argue, to point out that stability and value were more than physical assets, but I'd learned restraint. I let the comments slide, emotionally detaching like a practiced observer. I could hear her words without letting them pierce. My attention had shifted to things she couldn't manipulate: spreadsheets, investments, and my own professional growth. A few months later, I received another promotion, senior director. My salary jumped to $152,000 plus a performance bonus. I didn't announce it to family. I updated the spreadsheet, watching the numbers climb. I calculated compound growth on investments I'd been feeding quietly for years, each month adding more, compounding, silent proof of my discipline. The figures in that file weren't bragging. They were shields, evidence of my autonomy and capability. Around that time, I started touring houses on my own. Weekend mornings, I drove through neighborhoods I liked, walked into open houses, examined layouts, imagined furniture placement. I never mentioned any of it. No text messages, no calls to friends or family, no social media hints. I wanted to feel the freedom of choice, the ownership of this process, without commentary, approval, or judgment hovering overhead. I made notes in my personal journal, snapping pictures of floor plans and measurements, considering proximity to work, schools, parks. It was exhilarating and terrifying. I was making decisions for myself in a realm where my mother had tried to define my worth for decades. For once, my success wasn't performative. It wasn't framed as a lesson to anyone. It was mine. Each visit, each calculation, each careful inspection reinforced the growing certainty that I could write my own narrative, one that couldn't be rewritten by nostalgia, favoritism, or family approval. Her attempts to define me through the men I dated, the houses I could afford, or the social markers of responsibility faded into the background. I was quietly building a life that measured success in independence, strategic patience, and deliberate growth, metrics she couldn't manipulate or publicly flaunt. By the time spring arrived, I was financially secure, professionally validated, and quietly preparing for a milestone I hadn't dared imagine years earlier: buying a home on my own terms, without anyone else's story attached to it. Dinner that Easter was bright, with sunlight streaming through Lauren's tall windows and the smell of roasted vegetables hanging in the air. My mother, Denise, stood and raised her glass, smiling broadly, and gave the usual toast about celebrating responsible homeowners. She lingered on Lauren's house, on the careful renovations, the new floors, the kitchen that gleamed under the chandelier. Then her gaze shifted, just for me. The warmth in her tone pivoted subtly, carefully. Now sympathy, soft concern, like she was protecting the fragile daughter everyone else had been warned about. I waited. The words I'd rehearsed for months rose calmly from my chest. "I closed on a house in Crestview," I said. My voice was steady, but my heart thumped. The room went still, forks paused midair, glasses frozen. A few relatives' eyebrows shot up. I could see Lauren's mouth slightly open, her expression caught between disbelief and curiosity. Denise's reaction was immediate. "That's impossible," she said, her voice tight. Her hands fluttered to her sides, then back to the edge of her plate. She blinked rapidly, as if forcing herself to make the words fit reality. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved the envelope, sliding it across to her plate. "You should open this," I said. No inflection, no anger, just clarity. Her fingers shook as she peeled the seal. The paper slipped once, twice. Finally, she lifted it, scanning the bank records I had printed from the statements Uncle Robert had sent. I explained calmly, almost mechanically, "This is the withdrawal from my custodial account at 19. 2 weeks later, the same amount shows up in your joint account, then applied to Lauren's down payment." The timing is exact. At that moment, the door opened. Uncle Robert stepped in, slightly out of breath, and handed me the original statements he had kept for years. "I witnessed the paperwork myself," he said. "I made copies for you." His presence confirmed the facts, solidifying the narrative I had quietly rebuilt for over a year. Denise froze. Her layered reactions flickered across her face, first a sharp deflection, "Well, that was a different context." Then a fleeting denial, "I don't know what you mean," and finally a shift in her breath, shallow and quick, as if oxygen itself couldn't keep up with the surprise. Her carefully constructed public persona faltered. My father, Mark, slumped slightly in his chair. The disappointment, the realization that the story he had perhaps never questioned, landed visibly on him. His face looked crushed, silent acknowledgement of truths he had never confronted. Lauren stared at me, truly stunned, her hand hovering over her wine glass. For a moment, she didn't speak. I could see her processing the layers of her own assumptions, the budgeting narrative, the praise, the belief that her success had been singularly her own. I looked directly at my mother, my voice clear and firm. "For 14 years, you told me my college funds were gone, that I wasn't ready, that renting was safer. You rewrote my financial story. That was a lie for 14 years. The weight of the words seemed to anchor the room, undeniable. And in that instant, the story she had curated so carefully unraveled around her, leaving everyone to reckon with the truth. After I named the 14-year lie, the room didn't immediately erupt. There was just silence, heavy, almost tactile, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every small movement feel amplified. Utensils clinked faintly against plates. Someone shifted in their chair, and it sounded deafening. Denise's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She tried to redirect, a nervous laugh, a comment about the dinner, anything to deflect from the records laid bare in front of her. "Well, that's just paperwork. Numbers can be misleading." Her voice wavered, pitched slightly higher than usual, betraying a tension she could no longer mask. But it didn't work. The documentation was undeniable. Each transfer, each date, every signed statement from Uncle Robert, it all pointed to the truth. The proof didn't need embellishment. She couldn't erase it with charm or veiled concern, and the shift in her authority was immediate and visible. I watched her carefully, noting the rapid flicker of her eyes from me to my uncle, then back again. She attempted a few half-sentences of explanation, fragments that trailed off into nothing, as if her voice itself couldn't keep pace with the story unraveling before her. Her breath hitched subtly, shallow and fast. The sympathetic mask she had perfected over decades cracked in real time. Around the table, the emotional energy shifted. Lauren sat stiffly, still processing her own realization. My father's shoulders sagged, defeated but awake to the truth. Extended family members who had always deferred to Denise now looked toward me with quiet acknowledgement, their earlier assumptions dissolving into recognition of something they hadn't dared see. The balance of authority in that room had changed, and it did so instantly. I noticed it, and I felt it, a calm clarity settling in. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. There was no longer a narrative I had to protect, no preemptive explanation required. The story, meticulously documented and quietly prepared, spoke louder than any argument she could muster. Denise shifted in her seat again, smaller now, the attempt to dominate conversation gone. Her gaze flicked downward, then to the envelope, and lingered there unsteady. I didn't interrupt. I let the pause hang, let the weight of the exposure settle into her posture, into her voice, into the silent acknowledgement of the table. For the first time in years, I sat back and let the room react without me reacting. I didn't explain further. I didn't plead, defend, or justify. The power had recalibrated naturally. My presence was no longer secondary, no longer apologetic, no longer waiting to be validated. I simply existed in that truth, measured not by their perception, but by the facts I had quietly, deliberately assembled. And in that stillness, I realized the freedom in no longer being defensive, in no longer shrinking to fit the contours of someone else's story. The shift wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical, but it was irreversible. In the days and weeks that followed, the shift became tangible. Relatives who had once called my mother for updates, guidance, or favors began dialing me directly. Invitations that had previously funneled through Denise now landed in my inbox. Birthdays, gatherings, casual dinners, people started including me first, consulting me, acknowledging my perspective. It was subtle at first, a text here, a phone call there, but it built quickly into a noticeable pattern. Lauren reached out privately one afternoon. Her voice over the phone was hesitant, careful. I always believed the story about my house, about how it all came together. I didn't see it, she admitted, almost whispering, as though saying it aloud might break the fragile honesty she had just unearthed in herself. She confessed that she had benefited from favoritism, had never questioned the narrative, and felt guilty realizing how much she'd assumed was her own doing. There was relief in her voice too, not just remorse, but the quiet liberation of finally seeing the truth. Meanwhile, my mother, Denise, was struggling visibly with her own exclusion. Phone calls meant for her were no longer coming through. Texts bounced back or were ignored politely. The social authority she had relied upon for decades was shifting under her hands. I could hear it in her voice when she called, flustered and defensive. I don't understand why everyone is bypassing me. I'm their mother. I should know these things first. The edge in her tone was tinged with disbelief, hurt, and a subtle acknowledgement that control had quietly moved elsewhere. Eventually, the most surprising moment came in an offhand, unguarded conversation with Denise. She said, finally, almost breaking as she spoke, I don't even know how to be honest. Her voice was softer than I had heard in years, stripped of rehearsal or performance. For the first time, she offered something straightforward, a statement devoid of deflection, denial, or manipulation. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was real. It was a crack in the armor she had meticulously maintained, a glimpse of vulnerability she had never revealed publicly. The room of family, once structured rigidly around her narratives, had subtly reorganized. The social power had shifted, not with loud declarations, but through recognition, acknowledgement, and a tacit acceptance of facts. I wasn't demanding attention, I wasn't seeking revenge. The recalibration happened naturally, quietly, and irrevocably. Invitations, respect, consideration, these now flowed through me, through the person I had quietly built, rather than through the stories she had curated. And with each interaction, each conversation, each acknowledgement from relatives, the pattern of favoritism, deception, and manipulation unraveled further, leaving a family dynamic that could no longer ignore the truth. My position was no longer defensive, no longer reactive. It was observed, undeniable, and self-contained. I existed in it without needing to justify or fight. The new order was silently clear. After the dust settled, the first small but meaningful gesture came from my father. He came by my house one Saturday morning to help reinforce the deck railing, a task I'd been putting off for weeks. We worked side by side, his presence quiet but steady, no words of judgment, just support. It was a subtle reminder that while my mother had measured life in square footage and Lauren in comparison, my father measured differently. He measured presence and care. That weekend, I felt a calm permanence settling in, as though my life, my achievements, were mine to steward, fully and without apology. Shortly after, I received a promotion to Vice President of Information Security. The news was exhilarating, but I didn't post it on social media or announce it to family. Instead, I let it sit quietly alongside my growing investments, the Crestview house I had toured alone, and the years of preparation that had brought me here. Each milestone was deliberate, strategic, and entirely under my control. It was the culmination of a long, silent recalibration that had started the moment Uncle Robert handed me those statements. Dinner with Uncle Robert soon followed. We sat around my kitchen table, the lighting soft, his eyes a mix of pride and quiet amusement. He told me something that made my chest tighten. My grandmother, Alina, had been the one who originally funded my college account. She always wanted you to have it, he said. She believed in you long before anyone else did. It was a revelation that reframed the entire narrative. The money that had been manipulated wasn't just numbers on a statement. It was a legacy of trust and hope that had been misappropriated, delayed, and misrepresented for far too long. I felt a wave of clarity and ownership, a sense that I was finally aligned with the truth of my own life. That Thanksgiving, Lauren extended an invite. I accepted, but on my terms I drove myself and I left when I chose. No obligations, no performances, no quiet apologies for existing in my own story. I arrived, I engaged on my own schedule, and I left with the ease of someone who no longer needed validation from the people around her. It was quiet, but it was emphatically mine. I realized then how differently I measured life now. I measured it in boundaries I could maintain, in preparation I could control, in the ownership of what was unequivocally mine. Property, money, accolades, they weren't trophies to impress, they were instruments to enforce agency. And the freedom of that understanding, the ability to navigate my own narrative without the weight of someone else's curated stories, was profound. The family dynamic had shifted irreversibly. I was no longer defensive, no longer apologetic, no longer shrinking to fit the contours of someone else's expectations. The power, the authority, and the clarity were mine, quietly absolute. For the first time, I sat back and felt fully dominant in the only way that mattered, in my own life, on my own terms. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out another story in the description below. Sometimes the quietest victories are the most powerful.